Thank you all for joining us and welcome to today's virtual reunion program, The Rhetoric of Conspiracies. My name is Heather Corbett. I work in the Bates Alumni Engagement Office, and I'm so pleased that everyone can join us this evening. Before we begin, I want to share just a few housekeeping items with you. First of all, a live transcription is available for anyone who needs it. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can toggle the captions on and off by clicking the live transcript button. You can ask questions after the presentation, either by using the chat or by using the raise your hand feature, which is located under the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the chat will be closed during the presentation. Please stay muted unless you're asked to unmute yourself. You can also stop your video if you prefer your screen to not be seen by the group. Of course, we encourage you to add your class year to your name display so that we can see which class you're representing today. If you'd like to see more of your fellow alumni, you can watch this program in gallery view. If you want to focus on the presenter, make sure you choose speaker view. You'll see the view button in the top right corner of your screen. And please know that we are recording this session so that those who can't attend can watch at a later date. So if you know friends who wanted to see this and couldn't join us, the recording will be available. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Stephanie Kelley-Romano, an associate professor of rhetoric, film, and screen studies, who has taught at Bates since 1999. An accomplished teacher and scholar, Professor Kelley-Romano is known for her professional focus on topics in the popular consciousness, including feminist television criticism, conspiracy theories, presidential campaign rhetoric, and the narratives of people who think they've been abducted by aliens. Professor Kelley-Romano received the 2019 Ruth M. and Robert H. Krepsik Award for Excellence in Teaching. And this year, she's been awarded a Phillips Fellowship and will be conducting research about rhetoric, gender, recovery, and narrative. Professor Kelley-Romano received her PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Kansas and both her BS and MA in Communication Studies from Emerson College in Boston. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Kelley-Romano to Virtual Reunion 2021.
Thank you, Heather. Hi, all. I'm seeing students. I didn't anticipate the little joy in my heart. It's like, hey, yeah, woo. So this is really great. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll just get right to it, and then we can do some conversation and questions at the end. So let me demonstrate my technical abilities here after teaching for a year on the Zoom. Okay, so thank you, like I said, Heather, very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. So this is me, my information. These slides will be available after if you have additional questions that you want to ask. My email address is here. So basically, I want to get right to it. I started publishing about conspiracies in 2008 when I was writing about the X-Files. I also published with a student about Donald Trump and the birther movement. I've also explored the spread of conspiracies with epidemiology models and mathematics professor Meredith Greer. And I looked at Fox News and the Kavanaugh hearings in terms of conspiracy coverage. So a lot of my current scholarship and teaching looks at conspiracy theories. When I started researching conspiracies in graduate school, it was the late 90s. I went when I was about 10 years old. And conspiracies and conspiracy theories were still considered very much on the fringe, right? When we talked about who believed in conspiracies, we talked about what psychological predispositions they might have. And as a topic of research, conspiracy theories were somewhat dismissed or thought of as ancillary to important scholarship. And as the woman who interviewed people who thought they had been abducted by aliens, which is a talk obviously for another day, and also studied conspiracies, I think that sometimes I was dismissed a bit prematurely as well. But how the tables have turned, right? Since then, we have had a conspiracy theorist in the White House The Pentagon has acknowledged and rebranded, right, UFOs to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. And the newest season of Fortnite even uses aliens, which I will be downloading shortly after this presentation. So, and through this all, we've experienced a global pandemic with an uncertain origin, and we have raised the debates and discussions around vaccines to an overwhelming and arguably deafening level, right? So it seems that conspiracies are no longer on the fringe. And just yesterday, I saw this headline, right, which demonstrates the tenuous relationship between truth and conspiracy theories. So tonight, I think I can move this, and then you don't have to see that. So tonight I've prepared about 40 minutes of math 30, but sometimes I do tangents. So about 30 minutes of information about conspiracy theories. And not surprisingly, there's no way I can cover it all. I teach a short-term course on conspiracies. I'm developing a semester-long course on conspiracy rhetoric. And so my goal tonight is to simply raise some issues that I think are important and that I think that we should start thinking about and talking about when we talk about conspiracy theories. And then at the end, as Heather mentioned, I'm going to take some questions, and I also have some resources for further readings if people are interested. And so I want to really try to get to three big questions, right? What is a conspiracy theory? Why do people believe conspiracy theories? And how do I protect myself from conspiracy theories? And or maybe how do I talk to my cousin Margaret at Thanksgiving about conspiracy theories when she believes them? So before I begin any virtual talk, I start with this whole what is rhetoric question, because it's always what I get when I say I'm a professor of rhetoric. And it's really where we need to start so that you can understand the disciplinary boundaries within which I work regarding conspiracy rhetoric. And it also gives us clarity and precision regarding language, which I think is one of the most important things when it comes to conspiracy rhetoric. So what is rhetoric? When we talk about rhetoric, we're talking about communication and persuasion, but we're also talking about the creation of truth, what we believe. And we create truth through forms, think in terms of speeches or Twitter or television shows, and symbols. Think in terms of language. Language is obviously the biggest symbol system that we have, but also visual symbols, right? These things communicate and they persuade. And so we consider both forms and symbols. And I also consider the role of authority and expertise in the creation of truth and what we choose to believe or what we do believe, as well as the broader cultural context that potentially inhibits or encourages the acceptance of particular sources and explanations in the creation of truth, or more accurately, the struggle over truth, right? And like the current coverage of both the Wuhan Lab as well as the Pentagon UAP, upcoming report and discourse, both illustrate this tension over truth, right? People are kind of struggling to kind of understand what it's all about. And I'm going to use the anti-vaccination movement as an example right here, because what we have there is we have a public discursive space that is still contested, despite the overwhelming medical knowledge and agreement about the safety of vaccines. And so what exactly is going on there? When we want to think about what's going on, we need to think about some different types of information. And this, I think, is crucial when we're going to talk about conspiracy theory. So, excuse me. The most basic type of problematic information that we need to know about is misinformation. I knew I was going to do that. Misinformation. So misinformation happens when we mishear things, when we misunderstand them, or we somehow otherwise garble the truth on the way to understanding. So for example, I may have seen a study on the internet that says vaccines cause autism. And maybe I believe it because I saw it on my cousin's Facebook page. And so I might have misinformation, right? I might believe information that's not true. It's not a conspiracy theory. The second type of information that is potentially problematic is disinformation. And with disinformation, misinformation is deliberately conveyed as true for some usual political or financial gain. So it's basically misinformation strategically deployed. So when Joe Kennedy or Jenny McCarthy retweets negative experiences with vaccines to their followers in order to convince people to vote against mandatory vaccines in public schools, we still don't have a conspiracy, right? But that's an example of disinformation. And so even here, it's not the level of what I would call conspiracy. It might be deliberately manipulative, but not a conspiracy. And let me tell you why. For a conspiracy theory, there needs to be a motive. There needs to be some evil. And I put this in scare quotes. Richard Hofstadter wrote about the paranoid style in American politics, and Earl Krebs also wrote about conspiracy rhetoric as a genre. And it is he who adopts the word evil. And I use both of them a lot in my research on conspiracy. And basically, there needs to, in my opinion, be some nefarious reason for the happenings of history, right? Conspiracy becomes a motive force. So in our autism example, when the narrative changes to one where Andrew Wakefield, who was the former doctor who made the association between autism and vaccines, who was discredited when he was shown to be fraudulent, when he is said to be deliberately discredited in order to silence the anti-vaccination movement so that the government will be able to control people through vaccines, then we get to the level of conspiracy theory. So the conspiracy theory needs a motive, and it is a belief that there is a secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful for some larger evil motive, okay? And I'll obviously explain this more. So there has to be that evil at the center of the narrative for me to call it a conspiracy theory in my work. And what I do is I unpack conspiracy theories to understand what is the evil or, primarily fear that holds them together. And so this brings us to our second question in terms of why do people believe them? And understanding how and why particular narratives work in particular historical times is exactly the work of the rhetorician. This is why I love what I do. We are like little rhetorical detectives. It is ridiculously interesting what I do. And so when we do rhetoric, and any of my students, you should know this, I don't even care if you've been out for 20 years. When we do rhetoric, we consider what is known as the rhetorical situation, right? And Lloyd Bitzer writes about this rhetorical situation. And basically, he talks about three elements: the exigence, the constraints, and the audience. And we're going to talk about all of those tonight in terms of conspiracy. So when we consider the exigence, it encourages us to think about what are the conditions that call the rhetoric into being, right? And I can start with a little bit of a spoiler in terms of actual social scientific research. Joe Uzinski and Joseph Parent have found that the level of conspiracy belief remains about constant over time. Okay, so even though it seems like we hear more about conspiracies, and maybe we do hear more about it, the number of people who actually believe conspiracies remains about the same. So even when we feel, and I feel this way, even when we feel that this moment is heavy with conspiracy, we can say with some amount of confidence that conspiracy theories don't ebb and flow as dramatically as we think, and that not as many people believe actual conspiracy theories as we may believe, right? Particularly when we parse out misinformation and disinformation. We also know that there are certain conditions, certain exigencies that make people more likely to believe in conspiracies. So, for example, we know in times of uncertainty, conspiracy beliefs rise because people want explanations. And for us as humans, the size of the event requires an appropriately sized explanation. So, when Princess Diana dies in a horrible car crash, this explanation was insufficient for many people. And so all of these conspiracy theories are offered, and some of them ring true, right? They have this narrative probability. They feel correct. And so they rang true for some people. Additionally, conspiracy theories capitalize on a lack of trust, both in official explanations and in institutions. We also know from the research that in times of especially economic destabilization, we have increased beliefs in conspiracy theories. And likewise, when things have perceived risks, conspiracy theories tend to be more believed and more salient. So for us today, it's relevant because, global pandemic, unknowable risk, check, right? Economic instability, check. Lack of simple, easy answers, check. Confusion and fear, check. We are in this perfect storm of cultural, historical, psychological exigencies, which are conducive to conspiracy theorizing. So this exigence, sorry, allergies, yay, Maine. So the exigencies we can begin to understand. We're in a scary time and we were isolated and put at home. And so what are we going to do? I don't know about y'all, but I Google it, right? So I try to soothe myself. We all try to soothe ourselves, and knowledge provides comfort. And unfortunately, here's where things get complicated. There are a variety of constraints that influence the type and quality of information that we receive. Now, constraints limit or massage the information that we receive. It tints it based on our individual or societal biases and attitudes, things that we oftentimes don't even think about or recognize. So one of the biggest constraints or mitigating factors regarding conspiracy theories is the dissolution of the fairness doctrine of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And so basically in 1941, this doctrine was adopted in order to ensure that all holders of broadcast licenses, both radio and television, would present controversial issues in a way that was honest, equitable, and balanced. Now, this was a rule designed to ensure that people were exposed to a variety of viewpoints, and it required those being talked about to be allowed to respond. So we adopt this fairness doctrine to present information to the public in a way that is as fair and as objective as possible. Then in 1987, which is not all that long ago, this policy was eliminated. And in practical terms, what that meant was that news reporting could now basically be positioned for maximum reader or viewership. Broadcasters no longer had to be honest, equitable, or fair. This is a gross oversimplification, but you'll get my point. So meanwhile, and simultaneous to that, we have the explosion of the internet. So as a medium of communication and opportunity, the internet is obviously gargantuan. It's huge. The degree to which it has revolutionized the way we know, the way we work, and even the way we think cannot, in my opinion, be understated. And so the constraints on information, as these constraints around fairness are removed, access to information explodes. And our individual ability to assess and weigh information did not keep up. We didn't have the tools to do so. And so the thing is, we all have misperception. We all believe some disinformation. And many conspiracy researchers note that most people believe at least one conspiracy theory. And so why is this? And I think it's the confluence of both of these factors. So I grew up in Boston. I grew up watching Chet Curtis and Natalie Jacobson on the nightly news. And I had certain expectations about objectivity, about evidence, about journalistic integrity. And same when reading the newspaper. And what happened was I was conditioned to read the cues of the form, right? So remember back the slide about the form, the speech, the television show, the meme, all of these things are forms. And Kenneth Burke, a rhetorical theorist, writes about, he defines form as the creation and satisfaction of an appetite. And so what that means is that as a viewer, I had expectations. So when something has a masthead and columns and headlines, I read it as news. When someone sat at a desk and had a picture back here, I listened to that somewhat uncritically because I thought there were rules around the presentation of news. But since the revoking of the fairness doctrine on the internet now, these same forms can be adopted by virtually anyone for any reason, and there are no rules. And so when this happens, people are primed to read these certain cues as legitimate because they adopt the form. So we've all seen sources that are not reputable, but they present themselves as legitimate by using these visual cues. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've said to people, hey, that's actually an article from The Onion, or that's actually fake news. Or the times, I mean, I'm not going to lie, the times that I had to do a double take on things that I was about to retweet or resend, that I was about to repost, because I was consuming it uncritically, because the form, I was responding to that form, right? And so although things adopt these newsworthy forms or these news cues, they might not actually be news, and they certainly might not be true. So the form of conspiracy rhetoric is made up of a bunch of different strategies. And I want to tell you about some of the strategies here, because when we see these things, once we know about them and we see them, then we can start to say, hey, so hold on. Here we go. So the rhetorical forms of conspiracy rhetoric. And overall, conspiracy rhetoric is a form that is really read through the lens of logical argument, right? This rational world paradigm. And so it feels logical and rational because it uses a lot of evidence, right? It follows the process of claim, data, warrant, but invariably contains fallacies of reasoning in terms of how we get from the data to the claim, or faulty evidence. This is important because normal rational argument does not work with conspiracy theory believers, right? So research has shown that if you include refutative evidence in an article about conspiracy, for those people who already believe the conspiracy, their beliefs are going to be reinforced. And anyone who has dealt with someone who believes in a conspiracy theory knows that providing counter evidence prompts those people to dig their heels in further, right? So that's one way that we can identify conspiracy theories. Another element is this thing called what I call webbing. And basically webbing is when various pieces of disinformation or conspiracy elements are connected and made into this vast conspiracy theory, like my little background here. An example of this was the notion that 5G spread coronavirus, which led to the burning of 5G towers in England. So the way the logic goes with this, it's because 5G was expanding and the coronavirus was starting to surge, they must somehow be related. Now, this is associative logic and it's false cause, both fallacies, connecting things that aren't necessarily related. But that is exactly the conceptual slippage that happens in conspiracy rhetoric. And so when we are making arguments in the public sphere and putting things like this out there, it's happening at a very rapid pace, right? We're not reading and rereading or checking it. And so it might feel correct as we read through it because it's following that form. It's drawing on that logical form. The next strategy is equivocation. Equivocation is when similar things are replaced incorrectly. And so the Birther Conspiracy provides a perfect example of this. And basically Donald Trump and others who believed that Obama was not actually born in the United States, they kept demanding a long form birth certificate. And Obama and his campaign continued to present the live certificate of birth, right? And basically these two documents were exactly the same thing, but a difference in labeling was exploited in order to support the conspiracy theory, right? Why won't he present his birth certificate? Why won't he present his birth certificate? And that's equivocation, when one thing is substituted for another. Conspiracy theories are also self-sealing. And basically what that means is that they create their own verification. Lack of proof of the conspiracy is read as evidence of the conspiracy's efficacy or the power of the conspiracy, right? So in the case of the coronavirus conspiracies, it was put forth that the coronavirus was actually just something that was deliberately designed in order to hamper Trump's reelection. And so Trump himself would come on the news or get on television and say that they, meaning mainstream news sources, were in on it. They, mainstream news media, were exaggerating symptoms, inflating the numbers of death, obscuring causes, hiding cures, all of these kinds of things. And in this case, what Trump was arguing was that the conspiracy was so powerful, the conspiracy of the mainstream media was so powerful that they could do literally everything. They could create, in very wag the dog fashion, create an entire reality. And so it's self-sealing. No evidence? Well, of course not, because they are so powerful, right? They're able to hide it all and silence anyone that would speak against them. So these exigencies and these constraints work together in order to make conspiracy theories more viable for people. And these specific rhetorical strategies are what are used to convince people. But then that begs the question, what people, right? So audience is the third factor that we consider when we do our rhetorical exploration into conspiracy rhetoric. And so audience is super important. I say that about every single part of rhetoric. I think it's all super important, but audience is very important because as we move forward to think about how to counter faulty thinking, we need to be very cognizant of the actual audience, because as I mentioned before, most people are not diehard conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theory believers, but they may believe misinformation or disinformation. And it's really important to know the difference because different rhetorical strategies work on different types of people. So for example, ridicule. Ridicule is actually a rhetorical strategy that works to counter misinformation in the early stages of adoption. So for people who are not fully committed to some attribution of motive, right, some conspiracy theory, ridicule and think like Saturday Night Live, John Oliver, can actually work to dissuade people of potentially false beliefs. So going back to the vaccines, if I believe vaccines may cause autism, but then I see John Oliver make fun of Jenny McCarthy and her anti-vax perspective, that might be enough to move me away from that belief, or at least destabilize the belief enough to cause me to question it and do some additional research, right? And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of it depends upon the experts that I am actually trusting. So if we know in terms of audience that most people are not full-blown conspiracy zealots or conspiracy advocates, but rather kind of victims of misinformation or disinformation, what does that mean? And what can we do? And specifically, like, how do we talk to people? And I don't know if you saw it, but the New York Times had a really interesting, like, interactive thing the other day about like how to talk to a conspiracy theorist. And I was happy that I did pretty well on the quiz, but I didn't get 100. I'm not gonna lie. So what do? The first thing that we recommend, or that I recommend, the first thing that I recommend is prebunking, right? Research shows that prebunking is incredibly effective because, not surprisingly, being ahead of the curve allows people to write the narrative and to decide the narrative. And when people have less information, they are more easily persuaded. And so the goal is to have the good information go into that vacuum of space, as opposed to conspiracy theories. So to provide information that people might feel fear around can be helpful. Additionally, affirming the actual process can also be effective in that it reassures people. And so I've given a bunch of talks on COVID conspiracies, obviously. And one of the things that we've talked about is the vaccine reluctance, right? And one of the major sources of vaccine reluctance that was cited by people was that they were uncertain about the vaccine because the speed at which the vaccines had been developed, tested, and approved, right? And so for whatever reason, people had these beliefs that FDA approval takes a long time. And so the quick approval of vaccines made people nervous in an already nervous time. So to simply have provided information about the approval process could have reassured people when they were fearful. But again, this information needed to be deployed when we first started talking about vaccines, because this type of information is much more effective when offered earlier rather than a reaction. And when offered as a reaction, it can potentially have that counter-affirming impact that we talked about in terms of committing people further to wrong information or to the conspiracy. So it can't be seen as reactive, because then the response is, yeah, we knew that they would say that. Of course they would say that. Second, we need to recognize that people are oftentimes, rightly or wrongly, emotionally connected to their beliefs. And I think a lot of times we really underestimate or devalue this kind of perspective. But people are connected to the things that they believe emotionally. Last fall, I was on NPR because wearing a mask became, for some people, a sign of disloyalty to then President Trump. So increasingly, things are politicized and polarized, right? And so often, unfortunately, people listen to respond, not to hear. Because they want to win, because they want to be right. And it sounds hokey, but it's true, because to be wrong is threatening, right? It causes fear. You sprinkle in a fear of like cancel culture and this hypersensitivity and this kind of media cancel culture that we have. And is it any wonder that people are defensive about what they believe? Furthermore, conspiracy researchers, people like me, right? We're all like making pronouncements about the types and qualities of evidence and sources that should be required or that you should have in order to believe something. And again, I don't know about you, but sometimes that kind of pronouncement or attitude, or when people come at me with that, my response is, you're not the boss of me. I'll believe whatever I want to believe. And then what happens is that I'll believe what I want. Relativism, right, tries to reposition truth claims as simply a matter of belief. And then we have this relativism going on where it's like, well, you can believe whatever you want and you can believe whatever you want, when there actually is kind of scientific, medical, institutional kind of empirical logic and knowledge. So my suggestion for this is be empathetic, right? Building trust is much more important than convincing someone in one interaction. And research has shown that people who do move away from conspiracy beliefs do so because of interactions with people that they trust. They're not going to read an article in the Atlantic or the Wall Street Journal and suddenly change their mind. But if they have an empathetic conversation with someone that they trust or respect or like or know, they might. So to be empathetic, and this was what that whole New York Times thing was about, find this point of agreement. And then rather than tell, ask. And this is hard. And this is super hard for me because I'm a teacher, right? And so whenever anyone comes at me with a false belief or with something that is a conspiracy theory, I want to absolutely go into lecture mode. I want to whip out my PowerPoint. I want to slam them with the evidence. And that is going to have a counter effect, right? This is exactly wrong. Instead, ask people why they believe that or where they got their information. And while doing so, acknowledge like the sheer volume of information that is out there, and that the amount of information we need to sift through to try to figure things out is significant, and affirm, yeah, that must be hard for you, or I've been confused too. This whole kind of identification and empathy, this building of trust, at least starts a relationship that then can lead to change. We can then offer them kind of media literacy web pages or a list of reputable sources or anything along these lines from which they can seek information. And many people, if not most, eventually will use this information, right? So, and again, I have to think about, when I'm talking to someone, I have to think about, how would I want to be approached and how would I feel? Well, if someone comes at me telling me that my belief is not correct and then smacks down some sources, I'm not going to be very open to that. But if someone has an earnest conversation with me and mentions some things later on my own, I might Google that, right? I might go check that out. And so that's kind of the goal here. Third, in terms of what to do, we need to, oops. Well, that just wrecked that. No. Third, we need to amplify sources and voices that are reputable. And this, again, I can't understate how important this is or overstate how important this is. In the first few months of the pandemic, the number of conspiracy and disinformation related websites that were being created and shared was astronomical. It was overwhelming. Because people were home, right? And so these things were shared and shared and shared. Meanwhile, the CDC website, the World Health Organization's website had like hits in the thousands as opposed to the hundreds of thousands. And so to amplify reputable sources is key. To share them on social media after reading them, verifying them to the best of your ability, etc. But to share those and make those take up space and have the presence, I think is really important. Next, as you already know, encourage critical thinking skills. Research has shown that when people who believe conspiracy theories are reminded of their own attachment to critical thinking and to rational argument, they will sometimes take those skills and turn them on and turn literally them onto, shine them onto the conspiracy theories that they might believe themselves. And they can actually kind of work their way out of it. Critical thinking can again be promoted through the sharing of media literacy materials via social media. And so when we were first told to stay at home, I had to tell my mother, I had to have a lot of conversations with my mother, but one of the conversations I had to have with my mother was that, Ma, when you Google things, the first couple responses that you get are ads, right? That's not going to be a news site, even if you think it looks like, appealing to those forms, even if it feels like a news site, it's not. And so you need to think about what you're clicking on and make sure it doesn't say ad in front of it. And also Google uses cookies, which a lot of the search engines do, which means that future searches are based on previous or prior clicks. And so if you want to get out of this echo chamber, right, you have to deliberately seek out oppositional or alternative information. And so basically the internet now has virtually the opposite effect of kind of the fairness doctrine's idea about exposure to alternative ideas. Relatedly, teaching people what to look for in reputable news sources is important in terms of media literacy. So there are sources and web pages that already do this. And so simply retweeting or posting those things, I've sent them to my mother, can call attention and create new wells that people go to for information, where they can go to like factcheck.org or snopes.org and check things out, right? And these pages oftentimes and pretty universally note that if you have an emotional reaction to a headline, if the article uses a lot of rhetorical questions, hey, ancient aliens on History Channel, I'm looking at you. If it uses a lot of rhetorical questions, if pop-up ads come up, these are warning signs that these sites may not be fair or balanced kind of news organizations. So these are just a couple of the basic ideas that I think most people can use reminders of, and that some people frankly need to be introduced to gently and with empathy. But I think that they're at least a beginning, because most of us who research conspiracies agree that disinformation doesn't gain traction, right? Misinformation becomes disinformation, or misinformation becomes disinformation, becomes conspiracy theory. It won't gain that traction among people with scientific or media literacy. The problem is that as humans, we tend very much to not be aware of our own blind spots. We often overestimate our knowledge, and we think that it can't happen to us when in fact it already has. And so my motto is kind of constant vigilance, and use every interaction as an opportunity, hopefully to teach, but also to learn. And so that is all I have for you for today. And so I'm happy to take questions.
So if folks have questions, you can write them in the chat. You can also raise your hand by using.
I have a question, or can I just ask the question?
Sure.
What if there's like how do you address, I don't want to say elements of truth, but if you're talking to someone who believes in conspiracy theories and they have, like they think there's some element, this isn't, by the way, Heidi asking this question, I don't want to make her feel badly. It's someone else. Here, I can't start the video because I can't use the computer. What if someone seems to have some elements of truth, not elements of truth, but you don't know a lot about the conspiracy yourself because you haven't researched it, but they feel like, they give you a few facts and there's some elements of truth. I like what you said about questioning. So how would you approach that for you want me to give you an example, or no, you know what I mean?
No, I know what you mean, but I think that the exact point, I think it's really hard, right? And so when I study anything in rhetoric, we do everything based on very specific texts, okay?
Okay.
So making kind of universal claims, I think, is one of the most problematic things when it comes to conspiracies. And when we go to talk, even when we're having like this kind of conversation where people want to genuinely be helpful, it's hard to think of the specifics of what might exactly come up in any given case. So
Yeah.
if someone comes to me and they say, for example, the Pentagon has been hiding information about unidentified aerial phenomenon because
Yeah.
extraterrestrials have been here and they actually live in subterranean caves and have been taking homeless people for food and medical experimentation.
And let's say there is a fact that there are subterranean caves. So in other words, some element of it is factual.
That's exactly right. So there's definitely some aspect of it that's right. And what I would do is I go to the source and I'll be like, whoa, that sounds super interesting, or I hadn't heard that. And, where did you hear that from? And do you think that that source is reputable? And what makes you think that that's a good source to listen to? And then a lot of times, things like that. And then I will say things like, oh yeah, when I don't know what to do, a lot of times I will, if I Google something and I see that, the first 3 pages of things are all leaning one way, but then there are 2 sources that are leaning another, and they're really hyperbolic and super emotional, then I tend to think that they might have an ulterior motive. So I would kind of bring it to the sources.
I think that this is just if there's someone from the alumni office, I really think that it would be neat to have a class that you offered alumni. It could be a short class. It would be so great, like a 3-visit class on all of this, because it's very interesting and relevant. So thank you very much.
Yeah, there's a ton on like fake news.
It'd be neat to have an alumni class. It's just an idea.
Well, I am, after this presentation, on sabbatical, so it will not happen this year.
It will not be yours. Okay.
It will not be me.
Okay.
But
are you doing when you do sabbatical, are you doing something related to this, or are you just no?
No, well, actually, on sabbatical, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hopefully write this alien book that I've had that I love on. I've got the alien book, and then I'm doing research about women in recovery and narrative, and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm interviewing women from AA.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Different project.
Thank you.
Hey, Bob Muldoon, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, my question is, a year ago, was the Wuhan Lab Leak considered a conspiracy theory? And is it today no longer considered one? And if so, why the difference?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Thank you. And I would like to say that I had done more research about the current state of the Wuhan leak, and I have not. So I'm not going to overstate any type of knowledge that I think I have. But what I can tell you is that one of the things I think that has contributed to this is the bantering and kind of the ease with which we use the word conspiracy theory in the popular media. So we'll say, oh, this conspiracy theory, but I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory or it's just information that we don't know the full extent of, right? That we don't know the actual truth or the full consequence of. Because like I mentioned in the talk, conspiracy theory for me has to have kind of this nefarious motive and this kind of evilness to it in terms of like what's happening and why. But a year ago, for sure, the Wuhan, if the virus came from there, it was labeled pretty quickly as a conspiracy theory and dismissed by a lot of mainstream media. And I think that one of the explanations I would give to that is that people were I think the mainstream media was very much aware of how easily people would panic and how quickly the lack of information coupled with the increasing danger of a global pandemic was weighing on people. And to try to keep people calm and whatnot, they may have dismissed that potential line of argument or that potential avenue of exploration a little prematurely. So basically, I think it's incomplete information that we didn't have then, and we're investigating more now. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
MWN from the class of 76 has a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it?
No.
Okay, I'll ask it for you.
Yeah.
For those who don't trust government agencies and news organizations, where should one suggest they go to get the truth?
Again, I think it depends on exactly what you're trying to know. And I think it depends on what you're trying to know. I think that there are independent think tank organizations. I think that a lot of academic research, I think a lot of those places are good places to go for information. But again, I think it really depends on what you're trying to learn and why it is you don't trust kind of the government or the official explanation or the organizations.
Stephanie, Phil from the class of 66 would like to know how you think our educational system prepares people to critically think.
I think we're working on it, Phil. I think we're trying to do a good job here. But you know, I really do think that the explosion of the internet and the absolute overwhelming amount of information and agency and kind of you know, just the amount of stuff that is now available, not only in terms of like things we can seek out, but things that we also see, right? So what was it? I saw something that was like about, you know, people feel less safe when in fact neighborhoods are more safe, but because we see more instances of it in the cable news, right? The 24-hour news network, we got to fill that cycle, man. When we have all of those kind of things, then I think we get really easily overwhelmed. And I don't think first of all, we're not teaching any type of emotional coping with things like that. I think we absolutely ignore that. But even the rational piece of it in terms of how do you evaluate a source? How do you know what a source is? You know, unfortunately, I will even still now have students when I teach conspiracy rhetoric, and the first paper I have them do is to write a conspiracy, and they invariably all come back believing the conspiracy that they were supposed to research. And then, you know, we have to go through the process of, all right, why do you believe that? What is this source? How did you get this? Is this any good? And so, but Phil, I will say that from what I understand, there's way more media literacy happening in primary schools, in junior highs, and in high schools, which is much better, obviously. And so they're getting to be a lot more facile with that. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Rick from the class of 91, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I know that, say, for example, in art, there is a concept that an artist can put colors on a canvas in a certain blend that rather than mix them on the canvas, he can cause the mixing to occur in your perception. The information that's there is partial, and your brain tries to fill in the blanks.
Mm-hmm.
I've had this happen to me in circumstances where I would be trying to process information, but only had a partial view. Say, you know, it's dark at night and I think I see something and it's not really there, or the perception is in my mind because I'm trying desperately to figure out what am I seeing and I can't process it. But I know this happens over and over again in human existence. What impact do you think it has on the formation of conspiracy theories that there's a lot of information out there, but not necessarily any particular patterns other than ones that we think we start to see? and we have a cognitive bias to try to fill in the blanks and create that pattern over and over again. Is that, how does that impact us?
That would be the 3-day course that the previous questioner wanted. But yeah, no, I totally hear that, Rick. And I haven't heard about that art stuff. And I would love to, if you have any links or things you can send me about that, I would love to hear about that. Because when you just moved to somewhere else, but when I teach the alien abduction class, we talk about memory and we talk about confabulation. And we talk about the fact that what happens is we don't remember things. We don't know. And we have this, first of all, we have misperceptions about the way memory works. It's not a Rolodex up in my head that I can simply spin through. And that when I have things happen, what I do is I put in causalities that give significance and meaning to me, right? All you have to do is ask my ex-husband about our divorce, and you're going to get a very different story from me than you are from my ex-husband. We have filled in those realities pretty differently. No, but he's a great guy. But so the memory and confabulation is definitely a big thing. And so I think in terms of, it doesn't just affect conspiracy theories, right? It affects everything we think we know. And I think that one of the most important things I would like for people to take away from this is that we all believe conspiracy theories. We all misperceive. We all make these mistakes, confabulation, create these significances. We all do that. And so for me, as a rhetorical theorist and as a person in the discipline of rhetoric, I believe that it is communication that is going to solve that, that's going to provide the transcendence. And so if we can have an empathic and kind of comfortable conversation about how do you perceive this? How do I perceive this? What based on what? What is your evidence? If your evidence is simply eyewitness account, well, that's a lot less reliable than other types of evidence. And so when we can agree on the standards of evidence, on the qualities and types of reasoning, then we're going to get to a place where we can then have a higher level truth. So I think in terms of conspiracy theories, those things absolutely impact us. But I think it impacts everything. That's the best non-answer I've ever given.
Thank you. Dwight, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. I was wondering if you see a difference between conspiracies that people really believe and those conspiracies that are more strategic in that they like the effect of claiming to believe and the things that will then allow them to take place. Or, I mean, take the last election. If you believe that it was not a legitimate election, it lets you, pass laws preventing people to vote, or, storm the Capitol, or do these things that you would want to do. And you just can kind of claim that it's based on this information. How do you know what people really believe versus what they just kind of say they believe?
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea. I do study people who think they've been abducted by aliens. And so in terms of the analogy there, I don't think that there are a lot of people who claim to be abducted by aliens for fame or fortune. I don't think that there are a lot of people who believe I don't think that any type of belief like that is something that is that we can be self-reflexively aware of, right? Like it is, by the nature of it being a belief, something that we believe. And so I don't.
Like take the birther phenomena. I mean, I would say a lot of people would just claim to believe that evidence because they wanted to delegitimize Obama as a president. And if they don't want to look at evidence, they don't want to dig deeper and get to the truth. They want to believe this and then act on that belief.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm I'll just put my email in the chat. I don't know, it's the same thing kind of with the people that I interview who have been abducted by aliens. I don't know that I care whether or not it's true. I care whether or not they believe, and I base what they believe based on what they tell me. And so, like, for example, when I study the birther conspiracy, the whole thing is if they want to believe it, I want to know why, right? So why does the idea of a Black president get you so itchy? Like what, and I don't care about psychologically, I don't care about individuals, I care about culturally. Why does this story gain such traction? Why, since like 2000 and like, was it 2002? No, 4, 6, I don't know. Really early on, it kind of, the birther kind of thing raises its head, and then gets re-brought up with Kamala Harris, right? So then birther kind of stuff emerges there. Meanwhile, when we say, well, should we require a birth certificate of George Bush? And people respond with, well, no, we don't need one from him. Well, what's the common denominator there? And so, like, I guess for me, and again, Dwight, this goes back to kind of the individuality of the text. What for me it is I would then look at Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. I would look at the actual kind of news reporting. I would look at what are the stories that they're showing, what are the clips that they're showing, what are the lower thirds, the chyrons, what are those saying, and how do those things create a frame through which viewers are supposed to interpret this type of information as valid or invalid. And so based on that, then I could say, there is this kind of white supremacist fear of a Black president or whatever the case may be. But again, it would have to be based on specific texts and things like that. And it wouldn't matter what they actually believe. What matters is what's the rhetoric that they're saying and putting out there as true.
I see. Yeah. Thanks.
And I think this will be our last question of the evening. This is John from the class of '87 asking, I'm going back to your introduction. Do you have any theories on why alien and UAP sightings seem to be on the rise or are gaining such a foothold at this time?
Well, it's because aliens are real. No, actually. I think, hi, John. I can't believe how many people are here that I know. It's so good to see you all. Truthfully, what I argue in my alien book, which is going to be called What's Up, which you should all buy and I will sign, and we will go on the Oprah tour together. But what I think is that aliens provide salvation, man, right? Like we are like surviving this global pandemic. We are in this time of just explosion and overwhelmedness. And I can't even imagine the psychological trauma that has happened to people over the past year. And so how lovely would it be if the aliens just came and they said, you know what? We can help you with that, right? Because what's really interesting is that despite the pop culture presentation of extraterrestrial intervention as negative, right? Oh, war of the worlds coming to rah, 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 kill us and take over. Despite that, many of the people that I actually interview believe that the aliens are coming here to kind of help us evolve spiritually and to integrate us into this galactic federation. And so I think that the possibility and the hope that extraterrestrials and UAPs and UFOs kind of present, even if it's just in the exploration of a fantasy and the suspension of the current freaking reality, is reason enough to look to the sky, right? Like, just get me off this planet, man. So that's what I think about that.
Wow. That's something to think about. And we're so grateful to you, Professor Kelley-Romano, Stephanie, for engaging us in really such a fascinating and very timely discussion. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.